Cinema often frames its technological progress as a smooth ascent, a sequence of triumphant breakthroughs, each neatly credited to the studios and visionaries who unveiled them. But beneath that official narrative lies a messier, more revealing history, one shaped not by celebrated trailblazers, but by filmmakers working far from the spotlight. These creators, operating on the fringes of the industry, developed techniques that seemed too strange, too advanced, or too experimental for their time. Their films slipped quietly through theaters, yet the innovations they forged would later reappear in blockbuster productions, polished and rebranded as entirely new discoveries. Across decades of science fiction filmmaking, patterns emerge. Motion systems designed in cramped workshops would later resurface as high-budget marvels. Early experiments with dimensional distortion, analog compositing, or hybrid animation would quietly echo through the aesthetics of modern visual effects. Techniques born from improvisation built from spare parts, consumer hardware, or unstable prototypes would become standard practice once major studios adopted them. And while these studios celebrated their breakthroughs, the originators rarely received acknowledgment, their contributions buried behind films that were dismissed, overlooked, or forgotten. Tonight, we open the vault on those hidden innovators. We revisit the projects that dared to challenge cinematic convention long before the industry was ready to follow. Their ideas did not vanish, they simply drifted forward without their names attached, absorbed into the broader machinery of Hollywood, until the line between invention and appropriation began to blur. These 15 films tell a story not of failure, but of unrecognized foundations. They reveal the strange truth that the future of sci-fi cinema was quietly sketched out in places no one thought to look. Small crews, low budgets, ambitious experiments, and creative risks, too unconventional for their era. This is the chronicle of innovations that survived without credit. This is the overlooked blueprint beneath the spectacle. These are the pioneers the industry forgot. One Dark City, 1998, celebrated for its dreamlike atmosphere, yet seldom credited for its technical daring, Dark City developed a hybrid effects method that quietly transformed how cinema depicts mutable realities. To show the city's nightly metamorphosis, structures elongating, streets rearranging, architecture bending, the filmmakers devised a process combining mechanical deformation of miniatures, layered optical manipulation, and precise digital interpolation. Rather than relying exclusively on early CGI, they fused physical and digital components to create transformations that felt uncanny but tactile, as if the world itself were responding to an unseen directive. These sequences carried a rhythmic quality. Buildings did not simply shift, they breathed, contracting and expanding in choreographed pulses. Shadows deepened as though pulled by invisible forces. Surfaces rippled in synchronized patterns. Years later, when blockbuster films introduced reality-warping spectacles, their marketing hailed them as unprecedented achievements made possible by cutting-edge digital platforms. Yet much of the visual cadence, folding skylines, bending structures, morphing spatial boundaries, directly paralleled what Dark City had explored with its hybrid techniques. Because the film achieved only cult status upon release, its innovations were not readily absorbed into mainstream narratives of visual effects history. Technical records documenting its deformation rigs and optical workflows became scattered, some lost entirely during studio reorganizations. Without these materials, the lineage of its innovations became blurred or forgotten, allowing later films to establish ownership over aesthetic strategies Dark City had mapped long before. Effects artists familiar with the film note that its influence is undeniable, even if rarely acknowledged. The movie's approach to reshaping environments became a silent blueprint for cinematic reality. Manipulation, a foundation hidden in plain sight. In the architecture of modern sci-fi visuals, Dark City remains the unspoken cornerstone, the early architect of worlds that move, twist, and reassemble as if alive. Two Screamers, 1995. At first glance, Screamers is a tale of paranoia in a desolate landscape, but beneath its stark surfaces lies a remarkable cinematic invention, a way to visualize subterranean danger without ever showing the creature responsible. To achieve this, the effects team layered miniature terrain plates with vibration patterns, then combined them with controlled particulate bursts and directional debris cues. By compositing these elements into live-action footage, they produced the impression that something was tunneling beneath the ground, responding intelligently to movement above. This subtle environmental storytelling would become a defining feature of later sci-fi thrillers and action spectacles. Hollywood eventually applied digital simulations to depict shifting soil, rippling debris, and ground displacement techniques widely regarded as cutting-edge. Yet, the fundamental grammar of these moments, the tremor before acceleration, the concentric ripples marking approach, the sudden eruption of surface dust was already present in Screamers. The analog techniques simply lacked the polish of their digital descendants, but not their conceptual insight. The film's modest profile ensured its innovation remained uncelebrated. Critics focused on its bleak tone and mechanical creatures, overlooking the delicate craftsmanship within its environmental effects. Production archives fractured over time, and key documents describing the composite layering process were lost during rights transitions. For many, the origin of ground reactive effects seemed to appear spontaneously in later blockbusters, absent any mention of the earlier work that made them possible. Some of the original crew later described a quiet, uncanny recognition while watching modern films. They saw their ideas distilled, refined, and digitally enhanced emerge in scenes praised for originality. Their innovations had survived, but their authorship had not. Screamers stands as an essential but uncredited route in the evolution of environmental storytelling, proof that the Earth itself can act as a character, and that danger can be shown not by revealing the creature, but by revealing the world bending under its presence. 3 Strange Days, 1995. Though often remembered for its volatile energy and dystopian edge, Strange Days pioneered a form of immersive cinematography that still reverberates throughout the industry. To depict the illicit neural recordings central to the film's narrative, the crew engineered a custom head and body rig that allowed the camera to move as naturally and as unpredictably as the HD and face and Day 5.2 characters themselves. It hugged the operator's frame, responding to each breath, each shift of weight, and every sudden burst of motion. The resulting imagery felt less like a point-of-view shot and more like an extension of human perception captured directly onto film. This was not a refined system. It was heavy, unstable, and demanding, requiring operators to sprint, climb, roll, and navigate obstacles in extended, unbroken takes. But in its imperfections lay its innovation. The camera communicated sensation, not just perspective. Panic surged through jittered frames, exhilaration echoed through wide sweeps of motion, and stillness became an unsettling form of intimacy. When modern films began heralding new generation point-of-view rigs as revolutionary, the similarities were striking: familiar arcs of movement, identical lens behavior, and the same visceral intimacy that Strange Days had carved into cinematic language years earlier. Yet its technical achievements were overshadowed by external circumstances. The film's release was clouded by tragedy and polarized critical attention, burying discussion of its groundbreaking visual methods. Many of the diagrams, prototypes, and engineering notes connected to the rig disappeared into storage limbo, and the contribution of its designers slipped out of mainstream awareness. Cinematographers who study immersive point of view often describe Strange Days as a missing cornerstone, a foundational chapter in the evolution of subjective filmmaking that the industry chose not to document. Its influence lives on in countless productions, even if its name is rarely spoken when credit is given. 4. Split Second, 1992. Behind its relentless rainfall and neon-lit grime, Split Second developed a lighting philosophy that reshaped how filmmakers portray futuristic urban decay. Instead of relying solely on atmospheric post-production effects, the crew engineered a layered water-light interaction system. Fine mist curtains, pressure-controlled rain rigs, reflective neon placements, and shaped diffusers worked together to scatter illumination across every droplet. The result was a cityscape that glowed through the storm, its colors bending and refracting in ways that made the environment feel volatile and alive. This practical approach anticipated the neon-drenched futurism that would later dominate big-budget sci-fi. Films praised for reinventing dystopian lighting often displayed characteristics that Split Second had already explored: chromatic halos drifting across wet pavement, glowing silhouettes melting into rain-heavy fog, and reflections stretched into surreal ribbons of color. Yet, because the film arrived without fanfare, its visual innovations were rarely acknowledged. As archival materials vanished and rights shifted between distributors, the technical details behind the lighting rigs dissolved into rumor. What survived were only the frames themselves and the unmistakable sense that this small, unruly film had mapped out a stylistic terrain the industry would eventually claim as its own. Lighting designers who rediscovered Split Second years later noted the uncanny familiarity of its aesthetic. Many had spent their careers refining digital tools to produce effects that this film had achieved practically, bending light through water, amplifying neon hues through atmospheric scattering, and shaping rain as a narrative device rather than a backdrop. In the quiet corners of sci-fi history, Split Second stands as a forgotten architect of the neon apocalypse look, its innovations absorbed into the mainstream without ever receiving the recognition they deserved. 5. Johnny Mnemonic 1995. Though Johnny Mnemonic was criticized for its eccentric tone and uneven execution, it quietly shaped the cinematic vocabulary of digital space long before CGI matured. Faced with limited technology, the effects team designed a hybrid system to represent cyberspace, animated matte layers, analog distortion fields, and synchronized lighting patterns combined into dynamic corridors that pulsed with chaotic energy. Instead of crafting clean digital structures, the filmmakers embraced instability, jagged transitions, oscillating data waves, and unpredictable motion cues that suggested a volatile virtual world. Years later, cyber thrillers would introduce polished digital environments, promoting them as groundbreaking visualizations of data architecture. Yet their spiraling grids, recursive movement patterns, and tunnel-like vistas echoed the foundations laid in Johnny Mnemonic. The film's handcrafted approach foreshadowed the digital techniques that would eventually dominate sci-fi depictions of cyberspace, even if few recognized the lineage. Much of the problem lay in perception. Because the film struggled critically and commercially, its innovations were dismissed as stylistic quirks rather than pioneering experiments. Documentation of the analog-digital workflow vanished during post-production reshuffling, leaving only fragmented recollections among the effects crew. As CGI advanced, the industry conveniently recast its evolution as a purely digital triumph, omitting the analog origins that helped shape it. Technicians who revisited the film in later years spoke of recognizing motion signatures and visual algorithms they once improvised. The flicker patterns preceding data collapse, the warping shadows used to simulate corrupted information, the spirals that guided the viewer through unstable digital tunnels. Johnny Mnemonic may not have won acclaim, but its influence reverberates through the cinematic portrayal of cyberspace, its raw, unpredictable energy reborn in cleaner, more celebrated forms. 6. Nemesis 1992. Among the gritty cyberpunk offerings of the early 90s, Nemesis delivered an innovation that went largely uncredited, an early form of body-mounted kinetic cinematography designed to merge human motion with camera perspective. The filmmakers created a custom harness system that stabilized the camera close to an actor's core, allowing it to absorb the momentum of each movement. As characters sprinted, fell, twisted, or collided, the lens responded directly, translating physical intensity into visceral, experiential frames. This approach predated the highly publicized body rig techniques later championed by major studios. In those bigger productions, the rigs were sleeker, digitally assisted, and marketed as revolutionary ways to immerse audiences in a character's physicality. Yet, the fundamental behavior camera sway, tied to muscle tension, sudden shifts, tracking an actor's weight distribution, the sensation of riding inside the action mirrored the analog experimentation executed in Nemesis with far fewer resources. Because the film existed outside the mainstream spotlight, its innovations were rarely discussed. Critics focused on narrative excess or stylistic bravado, not on the camera system quietly shaping a new kind of action language. When the production company reorganized, many of the original design notes for the kinetic rig were lost, leaving only the footage as proof of what had been done. In later years, cinematographers familiar with the film admitted they recognized traces of Nemesis in supposedly groundbreaking action sequences, the same rhythmic jitter, the same chest-level perspective, the same momentum-driven curvature of movement. Though seldom acknowledged, Nemesis helped establish the grammar of embodied action cinematography, a foundation the industry would eventually claim without referencing the place where it first took form. 7. Saturn III 1980. Though often overshadowed by production troubles and uneven reception, Saturn III introduced an animatronic methodology that quietly anticipated the future of robotic performance. Rather than relying on a single performer inside a suit or simple servo-based articulation, the team engineered Hector, a multi-operator robot whose motion vocabulary was distributed among several specialists. One operator handled rotational core movement, another coordinated limb extension, while a third supervised tiny mechanical cues, finger micro-adjustments, head twitches, and subtle pauses that implied processing rather than puppetry. This layered control system gave Hector a presence unlike other cinematic robots of its era. Its movements felt neither fluid nor clumsy, but strangely deliberate, suggesting a machine negotiating its own impulses. Years later, Hollywood would implement advanced animatronics enhanced with digital smoothing and stabilization, hailing them as unprecedented achievements. Yet many of these robotic performances echoed the behavioral logic pioneered in Saturn III: the hesitant recalibration before motion, the controlled stuttering of joints, the peculiar blend of calculation and instability. The film's reputation prevented such innovations from entering official accounts of effects history. Few industry writers examined the behind-the-scenes work. Fewer still understood how ambitious the animatronic design truly was. As companies shifted and materials were lost, diagrams detailing servo coordination, operator timing, and internal joint mapping disappeared. With its documentation scattered, Saturn III became easy to dismiss as a curiosity instead of a technological precursor. Still, those who worked on later robotics projects occasionally described experiencing a strange recognition while watching sequences involving complex mechanical characters. They noticed familiar rhythms, echoes of a system that had once required 3 people to animate a single, imposing figure. In the broader arc of cinematic robotics, Saturn III remains a hidden chapter, a film that charted a path forward before the industry decided who deserved credit for that path. 8. Brainstorm 1983. In its quest to depict the experience of entering another person's senses, Brainstorm developed one of the earliest immersive point-of-view systems ever attempted. Rather than relying on traditional handheld rigs, the filmmakers built a lightweight, body-conforming harness that moved as naturally as a limb. Paired with experimental wide-angle optics and custom lens modifications, the system allowed the camera to simulate perception, not just observation. It dipped, tilted, and accelerated with the operator's instinctive movements, creating a visceral sense of embodiment decades before VR-inspired cinematography became fashionable. The film also experimented with sensory contrast. When characters accessed recorded experiences, the imagery expanded into brighter tones, heightened clarity, and exaggerated spatial dimensions. This shift anticipated modern practices in immersive filmmaking, where visual transformation signals a transition into enhanced perception. While later productions presented such techniques as cutting-edge developments, their foundations echoed patterns that Brainstorm had already tested and refined long before. Despite its technical ambition, the film's turbulent production overshadowed its innovations. Public reception centered on external controversies rather than the film's unprecedented camera research. Many of the prototypes, sketches, and internal design notes documenting the rig's build have since disappeared, leaving only oral accounts from crew members who recall the demands of achieving such fluid movement with analog tools. When studios began promoting advanced point-of-view systems decades later, those who understood Brainstorm's contributions recognized the lineage immediately: the immersive sway, the extended perspective field, the emotional curvature of movement. In the evolution of embodied cinematography, Brainstorm is less a stepping stone than an uncredited origin, an experiment whose ripple continues to shape how films simulate the inner life of experience. 9. The Quiet Earth 1985. Although The Quiet Earth is widely remembered for its apocalyptic isolation, its most enduring contribution lies in how it visualized time slipping out of alignment. Without access to digital layering or procedural time effects, the filmmakers built a manual system to create temporal dissonance. They filmed staggered exposures of key performances, adjusting shutter intervals and subtly altering actor positioning between takes. These passes were later combined using meticulous optical alignment, producing ghost-like replicas of characters that moved slightly out of sync with themselves. The effect was unsettling, not duplication, but the suggestion of time echoing an instant repeating at the edge of perception. Modern films would later use digital compositing to create similar illusions, presenting them as fresh aesthetics for temporal anomalies or alternate universe overlaps. But the conceptual blueprint, the rhythmic delays, the slippage between motion layers, the faint doubling at emotional peaks was already present in The Quiet Earth, crafted by hand under far more constrained conditions. Because the film reached only a modest audience, its innovations remained largely unexamined. Critics focused on its tone and narrative rather than the intricate experimentation shaping its visual identity. Production notes describing exposure, timing, and alignment vanished after studio restructuring, leaving only the finished shots as evidence of the technique's sophistication. Nevertheless, effects artists who studied the film have acknowledged its influence quietly. Many recognized that the analog method used here prefigured the algorithms later employed to manipulate time in digital post-production. What the world celebrated as a modern visual invention was, in reality, the evolution of an idea born in a much smaller film. The Quiet Earth remains a testament to how cinematic breakthroughs often originate in silence, noticed only when they return in unexpected forms. 10. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. Across the Eighth Dimension, 1984. Beneath its surreal humor and chaotic pacing, Buckaroo Banzai concealed a technical experiment that would echo across future depictions of dimensional travel. The filmmakers lacked access to modern digital distortion tools, so they created their own analog system to simulate the violent, reality-warping effects of crossing into another plane. Using refractive glass plates, layered matte exposures, off-timed frame cycles, and hand-painted streak elements, they built sequences where the world appeared to slip, compress, and fracture around the characters. The result was a stylized form of dimensional instability, one that felt organic despite its mechanical origins. Surfaces wavered unpredictably, depth fields collapsed momentarily before snapping back into place, motion bled across frames in disorienting pulses. When digital effects eventually matured, major studios introduced their own versions of extra-dimensional distortion, marketing them as bold, unprecedented innovations. Yet, the underlying rhythm of these sequences, their oscillations, warps, and temporal stutters mirrored the handcrafted methods pioneered in Buckaroo Banzai. The film's eccentric identity worked against proper recognition. It was embraced by cult audiences but dismissed by much of the industry, which saw its technical design as an extension of its strangeness rather than a serious attempt at visual innovation. Behind the scenes, notes describing the distortion setups were scattered or destroyed during company transitions, leaving little trace of how precisely these effects were engineered. Still, those who worked closely with visual effects could sense its influence. Many later described watching dimensional rift sequences in blockbuster films and recognizing familiar conceptual beats, visual solutions they had once improvised under far less forgiving conditions. Within the lineage of dimensional aesthetics, Buckaroo Banzai stands as a foundational but uncredited architect, its experiments quietly absorbed into the mainstream without acknowledgement of where they began. 11. Android, 1982. At first glance, Android appears lean and minimalist, but its visual construction reveals a bold leap into expressive, emotionally reactive lighting. Working with limited resources, the filmmakers built a makeshift illumination system composed of neon tubes, improvised diffusers, colored filters, and pulse modulators wired by hand. This assembly allowed the lighting to behave almost like a character, shifting in intensity, hue, and rhythm as scenes unfolded, producing an atmosphere that felt strangely alive. Instead of functioning as mere set dressing, the lighting became a psychological extension of the film's themes. The protagonist's mechanical innocence and emerging emotional conflict seemed woven into the glowing palette surrounding him. Scenes would subtly shift from cool, distant tones to warm, unstable flickers, giving viewers the impression that the environment itself was responding to inner turmoil. Only decades later would similar reactive lighting systems, now driven by programmable LEDs and advanced color grading, be hailed as cutting-edge innovations. Android did it with analog trial and error, And like many early breakthroughs, it slipped past the industry's notice. Critics praised or criticized the movie for its narrative, but rarely acknowledged the experimental nature of its visual design. Production records detailing the lighting setups vanished over the years, leaving behind only fragmented recollections from crew members who later saw their methods reintroduced under new names. When synth-heavy, neon-infused aesthetics resurfaced in modern sci-fi, many viewers assumed they originated from contemporary digital culture. Yet the mood, textures, and reactive qualities of those spaces feel uncannily aligned with what Android explored decades earlier, an early signal of a visual movement the film never received credit for inspiring. Today, Android stands as a reminder that innovation often begins at the periphery, where filmmakers must create their own tools to express the future they see. 12. Starchaser, The Legend of Orin 1985. Years before hybrid animation became the selling point of major studios, Starchaser, The Legend of Orin quietly stepped into territory the industry had not yet learned to navigate. Its creators attempted a merger of hand-drawn characters with early digital environments, not as static backgrounds, but as interactive three-dimensional spaces. To achieve this illusion, the team devised an alignment method that required animators to match cell movements to polygon-based structures, compensating manually for digital camera shifts and simulated lighting changes. It was a process equal parts invention and endurance. Though the digital assets were undeniably rough by modern standards, flat surfaces, rigid contours, simple shading, they carried a conceptual clarity that anticipated the hybrid pipelines used decades later. The film effectively outlined how traditional and digital elements could coexist, moving together inside a shared volumetric stage. When animation giants eventually adopted similar techniques, promoting them as bold reinventions, the echoes of Starchaser's early experiments were unmistakable. Its innovations went largely unnoticed at the time. With minimal marketing and overshadowed releases, the film found little mainstream traction. Many in the animation world never saw it, and those who did rarely realized the technical ambition hiding behind its unconventional storyline. Notes detailing the compositing workflow were poorly preserved, disappearing as companies reorganized or dissolved. Years later, as hybrid animation became a celebrated signature of modern studios, some veterans recognized familiar patterns: camera drift synchronized to layered artwork, parallax effects shaped by digital scaffolding, and cell shadows aligned with polygonal lighting cues. They were witnessing polished descendants of experiments that Starchaser had mapped out with limited tools and considerable risk. In retrospect, the film's influence feels undeniable, even if unacknowledged. Starchaser was not merely ahead of its time, it was demonstrating a future the industry had not yet realized belonged to it. 13. The Last Starfighter, 1984. Long before CGI earned its place as a cinematic powerhouse, The Last Starfighter attempted a radical departure from practical model work by constructing entire spacecraft sequences digitally. The tools available at the time were primitive, polygon counts were low, shading was rudimentary, and rendering required immense time. Yet the philosophy behind the images was astonishingly progressive: digital motion paths, algorithmic camera choreography, and spline-based ship designs that could be manipulated with mathematical precision rather than physical constraints. The effects team effectively drafted an early blueprint for the digital era. Though the surfaces lacked detail, the underlying systems anticipated the workflows that major studios would later champion: modular assets, repeatable animation curves, and controllable virtual environments. When Hollywood eventually embraced CGI wholeheartedly, many of its innovations replicated the principles established here, refined, accelerated, and wrapped in the gloss of marketing campaigns that never mentioned the film that pioneered them. Its influence became obscured for several reasons. Critics in the 1980 seconds were unsure how to interpret fully digital spacecraft. Some praised the audacity, while others dismissed the imagery as artificial. Studio executives interpreted the mixed response as proof that audiences were not ready for such visuals. Over time, key render notes, early algorithm experiments, and digital models were lost during archival consolidation. Without these materials, the industry conveniently forgot how early the foundations had been set. Members of the original effects team would later describe watching newer films and recognizing movement signatures, the mathematical cadence of turns, the consistent interpolation of camera sweeps that mirrored their own early digital experiments, yet the credit flowed elsewhere. Today, The Last Starfighter stands as an artifact ahead of its era, a film that imagined a digital future long before the industry learned how to claim it. 14. Outland, 1981. Though Outland arrived disguised as a grounded mining colony thriller, its visual construction was anything but ordinary. The effects team developed a refined miniature compositing pipeline centered on atmospheric layering, drifting particulate matter, refracted glints of industrial light, and multiple motion passes merged to create environments that felt heavy with manufactured air. Instead of traditional matte lines and crisp separations, the team sought depth using haze, shadow gradients, and controlled flicker to suggest a space shaped by machinery and pressure rather than by dramatic spectacle. This understated approach prefigured the industrial realism that later sci-fi blockbusters would claim as their own. Films praised for reinventing gritty futurism often echoed the same atmospheric signatures seen in Outland: the glowing fog around mechanical arches, the dense silhouettes softened by drifting particulates, the metallic corridors rendered in layers of light rather than digital texture. Yet, few audiences or studios recognized that these ideas had been explored years earlier in a film dismissed as modest and unfashionable. The movie's muted reception ensured its innovations remained peripheral. Trade publications overlooked the complexity of its compositing strategy, focusing instead on its noir-influenced tone. As departments shifted and archives consolidated, the technical notes that documented its atmospheric methods quietly vanished. Some artists later recalled encountering nearly identical visual behaviors in big-budget productions, recognizing them as polished echoes of the experiments they once helped design. With time, Outland became a ghost influence, an uncredited source absorbed into the visual DNA of modern sci-fi. It built a new language of space industry, aesthetics, only for others to claim authorship once the style drifted into mainstream acceptance. 15. The Black Hole, 1979. Before major studios began touting multi-axis miniature systems as the next leap forward in visual effects, the Black Hole quietly built its own. Working at the outer limits of Disney's comfort zone, the effects team engineered a motion control platform far more intricate than what the studio typically embraced. Assembled from custom metalwork, reprogrammed control units, and precision shutters, the system allowed miniature elements to be photographed with a smoothness and dimensional depth that seemed almost impossible for the era. The result was a visual vocabulary in which space bent, stretched, and arced around the camera as though the film were glimpsing into a distorted gravitational field. What emerged on screen was unlike the clean, predictable miniature passes of the time. Models glided with eerie grace, starfields curved subtly toward the camera's path, tunnels of light appeared to twist inward. Decades later, similar camera behaviors would be celebrated as breakthroughs in high-budget productions, yet their conceptual foundation was already present here, hidden beneath a film the industry largely misunderstood. Complicating its legacy is the absence of technical documentation. Crew members who revisited the archives years later discovered that original drafts, test diagrams, and calibration notes had vanished. Whether lost through neglect or swept aside in organizational reshuffling, their disappearance allowed the innovations to fade from official memory. When Hollywood later introduced newly developed miniature capture rigs, they bore an unmistakable resemblance to the solutions crafted for the Black Hole, though without acknowledgment of the earlier work. Because the film struggled to find its audience, few recognized how bold its technical accomplishments truly were. Its innovations slipped into cinematic history like shadows visible, influential, yet unnamed. Today, the film stands as an early signal of what the future of effects would become, even if its authorship was silently reassigned elsewhere. Bonus fact: hardware, 1990. In the clattering wreckage of its post-apocalyptic world, hardware unveiled an approach to robotic behavior that, despite its obscurity, left a quiet imprint on how machine intelligence would later be portrayed on screen. Lacking sophisticated animatronic systems or digital augmentation, the filmmakers engineered a behavioral illusion using erratic servo pulses, flickering illumination cues, and carefully fragmented edits. The robot's movements were not smooth or predictable. Instead, they appeared to emerge from hesitant bursts of internal calculation, as if the machine were assembling and reassembling its own instincts frame by frame. The brilliance of this method was in what it refused to refine, rather than striving for fluidity. The team emphasized the stutters, the twitches, the interruptions in mechanical rhythm. Light sources pulsed in irregular sequences across the robot's metallic frame, making it seem as though external energy and internal processing were entangled. These imperfections formed a unique visual vocabulary, one that suggested thought not as a seamless stream, but as a volatile, unstable algorithm struggling to cohere. Decades later, high-budget films would introduce robotic characters whose mannerisms were hailed as groundbreaking depictions of emerging machine consciousness, but many of these celebrated performances replicated the same behavioral cues that hardware had sculpted with analog experimentation: the delayed initiation of movement, the slight recalibration before committing to an action, the impression of computation expressed through light and jitter rather than dialogue. The film's modest reach ensured its innovations passed quietly into the background. Production notes detailing the servo-light interplay reportedly vanished during warehouse reorganizations, leaving behind only scattered anecdotes from crew members who recalled building effects with little more than scavenged equipment and intuition. Today, hardware appears less like an oddity and more like a primitive blueprint for robotic subjectivity. Its fragments of mechanical thought rendered through imperfection, distortion, and flicker linger in the DNA of sci-fi's later machines, even if the industry has largely forgotten the film that first gave those ideas form. Taken together, these films form an invisible lineage, an underground map of ideas that pushed the boundaries of science fiction long before anyone noticed. Their creators worked in dim studios, cramped workshops, and makeshift effects bays, driven not by acclaim but by the need to solve problems no one else had tried to solve. They experimented with unstable rigs, improvised circuitry, fragile miniatures, and early digital systems that seemed more like alchemy than engineering. And for a moment, each film revealed something the industry was not yet prepared to acknowledge, but innovation does not always travel with its authors. Some of these breakthroughs vanished the moment the credits rolled, their significance obscured by poor box office returns or the shadows cast by larger productions. Others were absorbed quietly into the cinematic bloodstream, resurfacing years later in big-budget features, whose creators were unaware or unwilling to admit where the ideas had truly originated. What should have been definitive milestones instead became faint traces, remembered only by those who had witnessed their creation firsthand. Returning to these forgotten works is like stepping into an archive that was assembled by accident. Their frames hum with restless invention, their imperfections speak louder than their polish, and within their neglected experiments lies the early architecture of tomorrow's spectacle foundations laid in silence, overshadowed by those who built upon them. They remind us that progress in cinema is rarely a straight climb. It is a series of buried discoveries, rediscovered and renamed as the industry cycles forward. The future is often shaped by those whose contributions remain uncredited, their voices absorbed into a larger chorus that never learned their names. These films do not demand recognition, they simply reveal a truth. Innovation begins wherever someone dares to imagine differently, even if history forgets to write them into the official record.